The United Nations is known today as the leader of world diplomacy and debate. However, many diplomatic attempts throughout history made by the UN have only postponed wars and conflicts from happening just a little bit longer instead of totally preventing them. It is clear that the UN's regulations and other codes are not enforced properly, which is made particularly self-evident by Iraq following the first Persian Gulf War. The UN aimed to destroy and prevent Iraq from accessing WMDs, weapons of mass destruction, and to prevent them from further human rights violations against the Kurdish people. The resolutions were not obeyed, and until the Second Persian Gulf War, Saddam Hussein had continued to abuse his power for over 10 additional years of tyranny. Once the Persian Gulf War ended on February 28, 1991, the United Nations attempted to enforce its rules upon Iraq and Hussein, which George W. Bush spoke about specifically in his famous Ultimatum of Saddam Hussein's speech.
My fellow citizens, events in Iraq have now reached the final days of decision. For more than a decade, the United States and other nations have pursued patient and honorable efforts to disarm the Iraqi regime without war. That regime pledged to reveal and destroy all its weapons of mass destruction as a condition for ending the Persian Gulf War in 1991. Since then, the world has engaged in 12 years of diplomacy. We have passed more than a dozen resolutions in the United Nations Security Council. We have sent hundreds of weapons inspectors to oversee the disarmament of Iraq. Our good faith has not been returned.
UN inspectors were sent into the country to ensure there were no WMDs, but were disallowed by the Iraqi government to access certain areas. Here's a comment made by Lieutenant Commander Matthew Watson about Iraq's WMDs. All right. Thank you, Matthew Watson. I have a few questions. First question is, were there WMDs in Iraq following 1991?
Right. So there's been a lot of chitty chat about this over the years. After the first Gulf War, the UN came in, and there were supposed to be lots of UN resolutions regarding no-fly zones with the Kurds, active weapons programs for WMDs, and those are defined as chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons, as well as the destruction of and verification of destruction of all WMDs within the country of Iraq. After the liberation of Iraq in 2003, when we kicked that off, I can tell you with 100% certainty that yes, there were weapons of mass destruction found in Iraq after 2003.
Okay, thank you. Another question was, were UN inspectors refused access to certain facilities where WMDs may be held?
Right. So a part of the UN's efforts here, the diplomatic efforts, if you will, to make sure that the war did not kick off, was the arrangement for full and open disclosure of all weapons of mass destructions within the state of, or the country of Iraq, and the verification of the destruction of those. On numerous occasions, UN inspectors were either denied access entirely to the facilities, or they were denied access to certain parts of those facilities during that time. So, yes, Iraq at the time, the regime, did indeed break multiple UN resolutions about the WMDs.
Okay, thank you. It is made clear by Lieutenant Commander Matthew Watson and the Ultimatum of Saddam Hussein's speech made by George W. Bush that the UN, while making resolutions preventing the further manufacturement or ownership of WMDs by Iraq, Saddam Hussein and his officials denied such commands. and would go on to disobey them, despite the UN's efforts, going as far to even deny UN inspectors full access to desired areas. From this, it is clear that the UN's diplomatic solution was not taken seriously enough by Iraq or itself, because they feared if they went further with exposing Iraq, there would be retaliation leading to another war. But at the end of the day, their inaction led to action through the United States in the Second Persian Gulf War. If the UN had just taken care of the problem from the start, we could have avoided the deaths of thousands of Americans and thousands of Kurdish peoples. Another major failure of UN diplomacy was Iraq's disobedience of UN Resolution 688, which was made in response to the genocide of the Kurdish people. The Kurdish people are an ethnic group of people of Middle Eastern descent. Saddam Hussein was responsible for the death of over 100,000 Kurdish people, oftentimes killing them in brutal, inhumane ways. Sadly, UN Resolution 688 did not serve its purpose properly, and Kurdish people were further abused under Saddam's rule. In Iraq, what happened to the Kurdish people following the First Persian Gulf War?
Right. So, though not an officially recognized country, the Kurdish folks did have a section of northern Iraq that they considered to be their own country. As we all know, Iraq's borders were created by the British a long time ago. The people didn't necessarily agree to it. So with that comes some conflict. Now, after the first Gulf War, Saddam Hussein decided to launch airstrikes against the Kurdish people up north. And the UN at the time did not necessarily have the no-fly zone regulations or decrees in effect at that point. So Iraq, under the leadership of Saddam Hussein, launched those airstrikes and attempted to mass genocide the entire Kurdish population. Fortunately, before that happened, the U.S. stepped in at the behest of the UN with the no-fly zones and was able to stop those airstrikes before the Kurdish people were completely annihilated from the face of the earth.
Okay, thank you, sir. The resolution was supposed to prevent the abuse of the Kurdish people, but until the Second Gulf War, the people were still brutalized and mistreated. This goes to show the failure of UN diplomacy. The UN did not do a good enough job of enforcing its rules and resolutions, and because of that, thousands more died. From the evidence presented, it is absolutely clear that the peace terms and restrictions were not nearly enforced as much as they should have been. In this specific case in history, the world would have benefited if instead of being diplomatic, the UN had ended Saddam's rule altogether, thus preventing the deaths of thousands of people. It took over 10 years after his initial defeat for Saddam to be completely thrown out of power, which goes to show the massive missed opportunity and mistake made by the UN in their pursuit of diplomacy.